So in the last session, we were talking about the pillar of reason. And this conversation, I want to keep talking about this element of reason and mind and intellect. And so today, what I want to talk about is from both Shabastari's point of view and Rumi's point of view, what is the scope of intellect? What is the scope of intellect? So the scope means either the extent, or the range of intellect, but I like to use this word because it also can mean that which is being looked through. So that according to their view, intellect is a domain and it has a perceptive or perceptual aspect, and then it has an aspect of a domain of knowledge itself. So to them it is an entity that is both subjective and objective, if we would like to say, or a domain where there is a world of ideas of different kinds that are very important and which descend into our realm. But all along there's the domain of comprehending those levels, you see. So the scope of intellect and is how we will be able to see what the Sufis are after. And so some time ago, we were looking at Shabastari's idea about the world being like the Quran, or the universe being like the verses of the Quran. This was maybe sometime halfway through the year we were looking at this. And one of the lines, we can introduce this by looking at one of Shabastari's lines, where he's talking about the very first verse of the Quran. As we know, is usually we're saying the Fatiha, and the very first verse is going to be Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, or the name of God, the compassionate and the merciful. And he says in the Gulshan-e-Raz, Garden of Mystery, he says the very first verse was the universal intellect. As such, it resembles the B of Bismillah. And there are different manuscripts, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to first read the Persian and then bring it into English. But I'd like to, at this point, remind you that there will be two sources for the information about intellect, and one of them is actually Neoplatonic. So we will see that for the Sufis and for Rumi, there's one body of wisdom, and it has to do with the idea of, from the Greek world, Greek thought of the one, and then nous, and then psyche. Or in other words, another way to say it is the one and the universal intellect and the universal soul. And this came into the Islamic world very early because they were translating the classic works of Greece, which had been banned by the Christian world to some extent, and they absorbed them. They didn't see any conflict with their own worldview. But in fact, there are some differences, and we'll talk about those. But in principle, there is no conflict, and they didn't see any conflict neither. Any of these Sufis saw any conflict between these two worldviews. So you may recall that in the Greek model, there is the one, and the one descends to a level called the intellect, nous, the universal intellect. And in this thinking, nous is also found continuous in the human soul. So the human soul is in fact the place where potentially nous can be known. In Greek, what do they call the human soul? They call it the psyche. So the psyche is the next level that was explained, which is, in this case, the universal soul, if it's divine or from the world above. And even at this level, we could perhaps harvest some meaning for a modern person. For example, with regard to the scope of intellect, any of us, whatever we believe or disbelieve in, we could go out, for example, at night and look up into the sky and do what's called just pondering or observing. And if we were to do that, we might feel things, and some people might dismiss what they feel, and other people might at least acknowledge they feel some kind of awe at the size of it all, or there's some other feelings they may have, which from the Sufi point of view would be the kind of awe, whether it was looking into the heart of an atom or into the vastness of the universe. They might encounter the beginnings of what we would call mysticism in the form of amazement and awe. So from the Sufi point of view, this is an aspect of mysticism that one would actually feel some relationship to somehow, to nature, some relationship to the cosmos, or some relationship even to the microcosmos that one is looking at. And so starting with that point of view, which as I say, strongly influenced all of the Sufis, I will read from this particular portion of Lahiji's commentary. So here he says, Nahostin ayatesh aklikul amad ke dar vei hamchuboy bismil ayat. So this is, the manuscripts are slightly different, but basically what I read to you earlier is the same meaning. He says the first ayat of the whole Quran is aklikul, is the universal intellect. Because in this, it's just like the B of the Bismillah, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. So you have the first ayat, and you have the first letter of this ayat. It has a dot under it. It's often seen as the source. You see the unitary source. And he says in the commentary, Yani awale ayati as ayati kitab alam aqli kul ast ke awalu ma khalaqa Allahu al-aql. یک حدیث است، نه؟ و در مراتب موجودات این عقل کل و جای با بسم الله است که در کتاب آسمانی که قرآن است واقع است. یعنی چنانچه بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم آیت اول است از آیت قرآن، عقل کل اول مرتبه است از مراتب موجودات. پس در مقابل او باشد و چنانچه بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم مشتمل است مجملاً ببخشید که اجملاً بر جمعی قرآن عقل کل نیز اجملاً مشتمل بر جمعی مراتب عالم است. So he says, Lahiji is commenting, he says, in other words, the first verse of all of the verses of the book of the universe is called the universal intellect. And he quotes a hadith that says the first thing that God created was the intellect. And in the various levels of the existing things, this, in relationship to the various levels, this universal intellect has the position of the Bismillah, in the name of Allah, which is in this cosmic book, he says, Kitab Osmani, which is the Quran, and is found there. In other words, just as in the name of Allah, the Compassionate and the Merciful, is the first verse of all of the verses of the Quran, and the universal intellect is the first level of all of the levels of existing things. And therefore it has this correspondence to Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and is comprehensive in a general way, comprehensive of all of the sacred book, whether it's the world or the Quran of the world or the Quran of the book. And the universal intellect also comprehensively, in a general way, has this relationship for all of the levels of the cosmos. Now, in another place in the same book, because we're trying to introduce a poem or two by Rumi where we would grasp what he's trying to say, and it would be much harder to grasp what he's saying without this background, because Rumi would have had exactly this metaphysics and this cosmology in mind. So we're turning to another place in Gulshan-e-Raz a little bit later, where he's actually commenting not here on a verse, but he's commenting on the chapter heading, which is the قاعدة في تفكر في الأنفس. So this is the rule or the principle of the thinking and consideration within the level of the souls, or the level of the beings, you see, of the souls. And so here he says, in Persian, again, we're going to get a better picture now and a more comprehensive picture about what they mean by the one, you see. So as you recall, we had the one in the Greek thought, then we had intellect, then we had psyche. So we're going to see this reverberate through all of these works, and here's like a more comprehensive description that joins the idea of the one to other Quranic metaphysical terms that are very important to Rumi's thinking and Rumi's poetry. So here he says, بدان که ذات احدیت و اعتبار خوب ظهور و اظهار مقتضای تعیین اول شد که برزخ جامع هست میان احکام وجوب و امکان و محیط طرفین است و آن تعیین اول را قلم الله و روح اعظم و عقل کل و الکتاب و روح محمدی می نامند. ببینید عین عقل کل میگه که قلم الله، روح اعظم و عقل کل و الکتاب و روح محمدی، یعنی میگه که این چیز است، یک چیز است و حقیقت انسانی عبارت از این مرتبه است. So I'm going to translate up till now. He says, you should know that the essence of unity, meaning the one, by reason of the love for manifestation, and for causing the manifested world to come into being, This love, incidentally, is in the Hadith. I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So this is implied in his statement here. It's God's statement that he was a hidden treasure, loved to be known. Necessitated a first entification, which would be an interface, a comprehensive interface. Comprehensive interface between the properties of necessary being and possible being. These are Greek terms. And is in fact the joiner of opposites. So he calls this level Ahlikul, which has all of these other names. He calls it this, okay? And then he goes on to say, وَحَقِقَةِ إِنسَانِي إِبَارَتْ as in martabahas. And the human reality refers to this level. This, like in the Greek thought, Neoplatonic thought, as I said earlier, that nous is in the human being. So the human reality, veiled perhaps, is this level of aklikul. You see, nous. We see this direct translation into the Arabic Persian world from this Platonic, Neoplatonic doctrine. وَمِيَانِ إِنْ حَقِقَت وَحَزْرَةِ أُلُوهِيَّت هیچ واسطه نیست. And between this reality, meaning of the one, and its manifestation as the universal intellect, between this and between the divine presence, there is no intermediary. So they are continuous. Divine presence and the universal intellect. Don't forget, he's already told us. I didn't translate the second part in English about how he wanted to manifest himself, and he says, and this first entification is either known as the holy or sacred pen, the supreme spirit, the universal intellect, the mother of the book, or the spirit of Muhammad. You see? All of them, they have the same meaning as universal intellect. Universal intellect has a direct correspondence to Neoplatonic thought. These other terms, like for example, the spirit of Muhammad would have its correspondence, say, to the Christian logos. The mother of the book is particularly Quranic. It refers to the outside of time and outside of context Quran. And the Supreme Spirit is a term that could be found in many religions, and it would be the first sense we get of the connection between spirit and knowledge, which will hold up throughout Islamic thought. So knowledge, intellect, spirit are all very related to each other, where psyche is in another domain where these things manifest. Or another way we could say, as we said earlier about sky and earth, psyche is the earth, where things come into being and are seen, but their origins, in terms of their source and their nourishment, comes from the sky, in terms of these earlier. See, and this is a theory of emanation that was really brought into full expression during the Neoplatonic period, which influenced Islam. So then he comes to this other part about the reality of the human is refers to this level, and then he's gone on to say, and between this reality and the divine presence there is no intermediary. And then he goes on to say, وَهَرْچِ دَرْ حَضْرَةِ أُلُوهِيَّت است همه در نسخه جامع این حقیقت masturo markumas. And he says, and between this reality and the divine presence, there's not only no intermediary, he says, but everything that is in the divine presence, all of it is also found summarized in the comprehensively in this reality of what has been written, here referring to what is written essentially on the divine tablet, is another way that they would put it. Some people putting the tablet at the same level as the mother of book, and many thinkers putting the tablet at the same level as the mother of the book, of Muslim thinkers, I mean. Balke بسیاری از محققان مرتبه الوهیت را بینه مرتبه عقل اول که حقیقت انسانی است داشته‌اند و هیچ فرق بین ما نکردند. He says, in fact, very many of the realizers and also thinkers about true reality consider that the level of divinity is exactly the same thing as the level of the universal intellect, which is also the reality of the human being, the inner reality of the human being. And so they held that there is no difference between them. Okay, so some of them saw difference, and some of them saw no difference between these levels, which in any case we were told have no intermediary, nothing between them. So either you regard them as two realities that are contiguous, or you regard them as just one reality. Okay? Equating, so in that scenario, you can still use Islamic thought to look at Neoplatonic philosophy and cosmology. So the idea there is that you would have divinity, above divinity is what's called hahut, utterly beyond comprehension, you see. So there's these five domains very often, and the first of those are go from hahut to lahut, meaning from ipseity, unknown to us, from there to divinity. That would be the equivalent of in this doctrine of the one. We know it's one, but it's unknowable to the level of nous, which is knowable for the human being. Okay. So he goes on to say that و از آن جهت که این تعیین اول حی است و حیات موجودات با واسطات اوست مسمى با روح اعظم است. Very important idea, he says, and it's for this reason that this first entification, meaning the universal intellect, is called life, the living, hay, the living, and the life of all of the existing things comes through it, meaning the Supreme Spirit. Spirit being that light and energy and knowledge that infuses the creature and brings it into the domain of actual existence, you see. First of all, spiritual existence, and then secondarily into actual existence. و از آن سبب که واسطه صدور موجودات است و با واسطه او مکتوب در کتاب مستور که عالم مرار است گشته‌اند مسمى با قلم است. Next he says, and for the reason that this level is the intermediary or the interface from which comes into existence all of the existence things, and through it or by way of it, everything has been determined and is in a book written, meaning this is the idea of the tablet. So these would be like the Platonic ideas. You see, they pre-exist as ideas. They are defined, and this is called the pen in Islamic thought, you see. He says, for this reason, it has been referred to as the pen. وَأَزْ أَمْرُ كَي تَعَقُلِ خُود وَمُبْدَى مِنَمَايَدْ وَدَانِش وَعُلُومِ هَمَا از اوست مسما بعقل کل است. And from this point of view, or from this side, that it is able to perceive and know itself at the same time as all of it, and at the same time being the origin, or to perceive and know itself and the origin of all things, and knowledge, and all of the sciences, all of them come from it. It has been called the universal intellect. So here it's more of a splitting up of duties, which is less convincing than just the idea, the original idea, which is that it's this descent. But this is his commentary. And then lastly, he says, وَأَزْ جِهَتِ ارتسام آیات و کلمات موجودات کلیه و جزویه در ذات او مسما به کتاب است. So he says, and because on the side of the writing down of all of these verses and words of all of the meaning of the existing beings, as in the cosmos, the holy book of the cosmos, universal and particular, comes from the essence of this level, for this reason, that it comes from the level of this essence of this level of the universal intellect. It has been called the mother of the book. Summary and very beautiful look at how easy Rumi can help us to understand certain ideas. So let's recall that we have the idea of, as I said, the scope of the intellect. From this point of view, it's a very interesting idea, the way the Sufis have taken what they've taken this to mean. And they've taken this from Neoplatonic thought, but they've obviously evolved some of their own ideas. So in a nutshell, we see that not only is the intellect a domain in which all the entities exist as information, you could say. In the Platonic sense, these are ideas. In the Sufi sense of the use of Platonic thinking, these are what are called the fixed essences, the Ayanithabita. So there's this domain of in potentia. There is a unity that has within it, we would say, a fertile void. It is full of potential, but it is a unity. And it is the first emanation, but it comprehends the information of that which is what's called necessary and that which is called possible. It comprehends these two existences, and he says it comprehends and surrounds both of them, includes both of them. And this is called the first entification in some places, but it's also called the universal intellect. And the scope of intellect, meaning the scope of not only a domain full of inherent information, but a scope of perceiving. At the same time, this is the activity of perceiving and understanding, or realizing, you might say. So the self-realization involves a realization of inherent divinity, you could say, because it's also equated with the level of divinity. So what Rumi does is he thinks of this relationship as the relationship of a tree and its branches, and the relationship of the tree and its branches in movement with the shadows that are moving under the tree. But he decides that he will illustrate it in a practical way, which is the level of study and learning and discipleship. So he decides to include all of this in this area. And not only that, he gives his theory of evolution to begin with, so as to give it some momentum. So he starts out, what I think I'll do today is a little different. I'll start by reading the English first, and then read the Persian, because it's a poem, it's not that long. That way we will get the English twice, and we will hear the Persian. And this is going to be from Book 4, verses 3,637 to 3,649. So he says, about the human being, he says, because he starts this off by saying the changes and stages of the human being. He first came into the mineral realm, then descended into the realm of vegetation. He passed many years in the vegetative state, oblivious of minerality because of his struggles. Then descending from plant to animal life, he lost the memory of the vegetative state. Yet he retained an inclination toward that state, especially in springtime with all its greeneries. This is like when infants yearn for their mothers, unaware of their yearning's secret, the milk. Now, we'll stop there to consider this image, and of the influences on Rumi would have been one from Aristotle, talking about different levels of soul involving these levels, meaning is there material that Rumi would have drawn upon from Greek thought? And the answer is yes. We would not see this in the Quran, in other words. This is clearly related to this peripatetic heritage as well as the Platonic and Neoplatonic legacy in the Islamic world. And it can be directly linked up to certain texts that have been translated into Arabic and by Rumi's time would have been very, very well known. So this theory of evolution, though, what I like what Rumi does is it's not as simple as Aristotle's formulation, and it does actually show an evolutionary thinking, even in the modern sense for us. I don't mean in terms of physical evolution, but I'm talking about the evolution of being. So, because there's the idea of coming into an existence and living it, and then moving on to another existence and seemingly forgetting it, yet still being influenced by it, you see? So it's an interesting idea. So that first passage I'll come back to, but I'll do it in the Persian up to that point. So he says, آمد اول به اقلیم جماد و از جمادی در نباتی افتاد سالها اندر نباتی عمر کرد و از جمادی یاد ناورد از نبات و از نباتی چون به حیوانی فتاد نامدش حال نباتی هیچ یاد جز همین میلی که دارد سوی آن خاصه در وقت بهار و زمستان. همچو میل کودکان با مادران Sere mai le chod nadon dar le bon. Okay, so again, the English of this, he says about the human being, he first came into the mineral realm, then descended into the realm of vegetation. He passed many years in the vegetative state, oblivious of minerality because of his struggles, meaning evolutionary struggles, to adapt to new consciousness. Then descending from plant to animal life, he lost the memory of the vegetative state. Yet he retained an inclination toward that state, especially in springtime with all its greeneries. This is like when infants yearn for their mothers, unaware of their yearning secret, the milk. So this is this first passage. And what's interesting to me about this also is that he describes this evolution as a kind of descent from simplicity into complexity. See what I mean? Like normally this would be an evolution where you're kind of going up, and here he's describing it as a kind of descent. In the same way that Ibn Arabi does in the Fusus, where he says that the closest thing to God is the mineral. Because in terms of existence, it's closer than the plant, it's closer than the animal, it's closer than the human. Now he only says that. Elsewhere he reverses, just like Rumi, he will reverse the equation. But the other thing I like that he's doing is he's already planting the seed for what he's about to say in the form of the inclination or sentiment one would feel in the spring towards nature, because it's inherently still imprinted somehow in the large cellular memory, let's say, or on some level of the early brain. As you know, the brain sort of being a mishmash of add-ons from different levels, and so there's even some perhaps very real reason that one could make that case without even knowing about the brain. But also he's laying the groundwork for the kind of mythological and visual imagery that he wants to use about nature, that very often the tree of life is a motif. And the reason that might make a lot of sense to a human being is what he's trying to say, is there's some memory of the meaning of nature and what the symbolism of a tree might be. Because we find lots of tree of life symbolism, and here he's about to use that same symbolism that we understand. This is a tree of life, because isn't it true that it's already been established that for him the intellect is spirit? Now before I go on in this poem, I also need to tell you that that he at all times is associating the intellect with spirit, and spirit has the power of life, and therefore it will be associated with that which can bring things to life, and therefore associated with Jesus, because Jesus has the breath, which is spirit, and is able to give life. Rumi and the Sufis are aware that the abjad, the numerology for Jesus, is the divine name Alim. It's 150, in case you want to work it out. Jesus and the one who knows have the same numerology, and in the Quran, the case is not made for the universal intellect. The case is made for God as all-knowing. See, there are terms, like in the Quran, there is no case to be made for a doctrine about existentialism, because God doesn't stress the word wujud, quite the contrary, stresses the word life and living, which is again what we're seeing here. So for God's language in the Quran, you have this idea of spirit, life is linked to the idea of knowing, directly linked to knowledge. So it's the same relationship, actually, which is why I think the Muslims were friendly towards the Neoplatonic teachings. Language is different, but the teaching is fundamentally the same. But for the Muslim, there's kind of a broader sense of the meaning of the doctrine, because right away, oddly enough, intellect is associated with Jesus. Intellect is to some extent associated with transcendence, and Jesus is associated with transcendence. You see? So the Sufis are not surprised that the abjad of Jesus will be the same as the divine name, knowing. Okay? And so now we can read the next part of the poem, kind of generally keeping this in mind. And I doubt we'll have time for the other poem, but we'll continue this next time. And in the other poem, Jesus is figured in the other poem. So the two other poems we can do next time. Today we'll limit ourselves to this poem. So the next section of this poem, which you recall it, where we left off, this is like when infants yearn for their mothers, unaware of their yearning secret, the milk. It's like the fierce yearning of every novice for a wise and noble elder of bright fortune. This is the teacher, in other words. His partial intellect is from the universal intellect. The moving shadow is from the branches' movements. Now, what's wonderful about this, let me say to you, is that he's not yet letting on to you whether he means that when he says his partial intellect is from the universal intellect, we have to assume that would be true of either the teacher or of the student of the teacher who represents and experiences nous. See, because it's about nous. And nous is a domain, huh? In Greek thought, it's this level. You have the one, nous, psyche. Same in Islam. You have the ahadiyat, ahad, one. You have aklikul, nafsikul. But don't forget, he's identified aklikul, the universal intellect, as being continuous and connected to the human reality. He said they're the same thing. So the language can either mean here about the novice following the teacher, or about the teacher following the universal intellect, you see? So the language is still a little bit vague. It'll get less vague. It's not vague, it's ambiguous. There's an ambivalence between, there's like a set of relationships. We could say God, prophet or teacher, and human novice or human seeker. Either we're talking about a relationship between teacher and seeker, or we're talking about a relationship between God and teacher. So thus far, okay? So he says, his partial intellect is from the universal intellect. The moving shadow is from the branches' movements. Ultimately, his shadow will vanish within it. He'll then realize the secret of yearning and searching. How can another branch's shadow move if this great tree is not swaying in motion? The human was brought from animal to human by the Creator you are acquainted with. He passed from realm to realm in this manner until he became intelligent, knowing, and able. With no memory of the earlier intelligences, he will also evolve beyond this intelligence. To be freed from this mind of greed and struggle, he'll witness hundreds of thousands of minds. So you just see this eternity of change and striving, or you see the eternity of moments of individual human evolution, huh? You could take it however you want. I'm going to read the Persian, come back to this so that you have it again in English. And so in the Persian, as he goes on, he says, Ham chumaile mufrite had now murid سوی آن پیر جوان بخت مجید سوی آن پیر جوان بخت مجید جزو عقل این از آن عقل کل است جنبش این سایه از آن شاخ گل است سایه‌اش فانی شود آخر در او پس بداند سیر میل و جستجو سایه شاخ دیگر ای نیک بخت کی بجنبد گر نجنبد این درخت باز از حیوان سوی انسانیش می کشید آن خالقی دانی می کشید آن خالقی که دانیش همچنین اقلیم تا اقلیم رفت تا شد اکنون عاقل و دانا و زفت عقل‌های اولینش یاد نیست هم از این عقلش تحول کردنی است تا رهد زین عقل پر حرص و طلب 100,000 عقل بیند بوالعجب. Okay? This is the Persian of the same passage that we'll read again in English on this last passage. It's like the fierce yearning of every novice for a wise and noble elder of bright fortune. His partial intellect is from the universal intellect. The moving shadow is from the branches' movements. Ultimately, the shadow will vanish within it. He'll then realize the secret of yearning and searching. How can another branch's shadow move if this great tree is not swaying in motion? The human was brought from animal to human by the Creator you are acquainted with. He passed from realm to realm in this manner until he became intelligent, knowing, and able. With no memory of the earlier intelligences, he will also evolve beyond this intelligence. To be freed from this mind of greed and struggle, he'll witness hundreds of thousands of minds. So, we're just about at the end of the time, but did any questions or observations come up for you guys?
Beautiful imagery again.
Yeah, Rumi helps to simplify complicated ideas, certainly, and there's a bit of mystery in the passage that we would only be aware of if we understood his doctrine of unknowing or becoming selfless. So this is where he says the shadow disappears in the branch, for example. If somebody didn't know that doctrine, they may not understand what he meant there. But the image he gives us is the tree of existence, called the tree of life, in fact, by us in English, having the same sort of meaning. And life in the sense of it's so full, and it's a tree because a vast tree, and it has many leaves and flowers and fruits and whatever. It's very, the multitude, the multiplicity of life is seen in it. The second point is that it is a unity, on the other hand. This is the tree that I can show you at Novato that affected me so much. This is this very tree, you could say, because mythically I was impressed by this. I fall under the sway of what he was saying about the inclination, you see. And then his idea that so you could also say we have three things. We have a tree. He describes a branch, not necessarily in this order, and he describes a shadow of the branch. So now we could clearly see that there are three entities. And the branch is not annihilated, it is part of the tree, but the shadow of the branch is annihilated, you see. So that's why I said he gives us more information as we go into the poem. So essentially when it's annihilated, that's why he says, can another branch, when he mentions another, it's an important word, meaning that which is annihilated in the branch, he's no longer talking about that branch. So that's why if there's another branch, obviously there could be other branches, others who become illuminated essentially and become branches of the tree rather than shadows of the tree. He also, at the other end of the spectrum, says, how can another branch, how can it be moving unless the tree is moving? You see? So he has this wonderful imagery there, huh? And anybody else? Anything quick?
This clarification: the shadow is it the shadow or is it the screen that we're supposed to? Yeah, I mean, I understand that it's the tree, it's the sun, illuminating the tree, and then what we see is the shadow. Are we to really see the shadow that doesn't exist, or to see the screen upon which it's projected?
So in this case, what in our estimation is not known or is unreal, say, to the materialist, would you agree?
Yeah.
Or is theoretical for many people, if not most people in fact, is for Rumi more real. And what's not real as real is what we think is real.
Right.
So that's another fundamental point that we would have to understand in reading the poem. That for him, the universal intellect is the more real of the two. And then secondly, keeping that in mind and looking at his language, I'll just go back to that passage. The moving shadow is from the branch's movements. Ultimately, his shadow will vanish within it. He'll then realize the secret of yearning and searching. Clearly about this, the seeker, agreed? How can another branch's shadow move if this great tree is not swaying in motion? Now this word digad, another, means that there's another case of this, or there's some kind of additional thing has happened. Either that student became a branch and now has a shadow. You see what I mean? There's sort of a sense of continuity in the language. If you don't regard the word other as simply trying to keep the meter, which I do not. I think he's more careful with his language than that. So by using another, he's talking not about the earlier branch anymore, you see? So there's some interesting things. How can another branch's shadow move if this great tree is not swaying in motion? So now he's gone back to the tree again, and he's talking about another branch, and he says, that branch has a shadow. And that can either be another relationship with a seeker and somebody who actually embodies and experiences nous. Or it could simply mean the relationship of the universal intellect as the source of things to a branching of its manifestation to a manifestation of it in a more turbid domain. See, so that this is open to interpretation. But the thing I was trying to explain about the scope of intellect is I know it seems repetitive, but one of the things that I want to stress in Sufism is the primacy of seeing and knowing. In Sufism, often what is stressed is love, but very often that love is more like a sentimental kind of human love, which is perfectly fine, but which is not the same thing as loving something because of the inherent vision of its grandeur and beauty. We could say, on the human level, that human love allows one to see great beauty that one otherwise might not be able to see. But then if people cook up a whole lot of sentimental literature around this, this is not the same thing as that seeing which is bestowed upon the human being who opens to it. You see? Profound seeing and knowing. And this is again what he's talking about in the doctrine of the intellect, so the scope of the intellect. So tonight we will finish here, but I have two other poems of Rumi's about intellect. So we're trying to look at place of, last time we were looking at the place of burhan, logic. Here we're seeing that logic is related to intellect, but it's very partial compared to this doctrine of the universal intellect, which seems like a doctrine of infinite beings and infinite knowledge, right? It's very different from the limitations of the logical, dialectical process of sorting things out. That's a very different process, but it is a part of intellect, but what's usually called the partial intellect. Because usually Rumi is being negative about the intellect, because it's as I said last time, because the intellect has become the houseboy of the ego, and the houseboy does the work called rationalization. So that you will often see, just watch your own thinking, and you'll see that it's being shaped by your desire or by your fear, by your anger. You'll realize your intellect has been compromised. But one of the principles of this form of Sufism is that intellect is very, very important, extremely important, but it has to be freed from shackles of serving some other really more limited faculty or capacity or characteristic in the human being. So that's what we're trying to introduce, this bigger doctrine of intellect and mind. I'll often translate intellect as mind. You know, how many worlds have come out of mind? You'll see other translations of mind. And very often when you see, if I use mind with a capital M, I'm translating intellect. Because intellect is a very strange word to use in English. It doesn't have the meaning that they're giving to it. Mind would connect it also to the Buddhist tradition. If we use the word mind, it will connect this teaching to the Buddhist and other traditions. Other than only Western traditions, it will connect it to other Eastern traditions.